Hi everyone, my name's Jen Campbell. I'm an author. I make videos about books on this channel, and also I talk about the history of fairy tales. It's a topic that I love very much. In fact, I give talks on this topic at universities and book festivals around the UK, and I have a whole series of videos on this channel where I dissect particular tales. So looking at the stories behind the story that we think we know, and then the true history that may have inspired that story in the first place. So I have videos dissecting Beauty and the Beast, Sleeping Beauty, Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, lots. I'll leave them in the description box down below. Today we're going to be talking about Rapunzel. I'm able to make these videos due to the kind support from people over on Patreon. So if you enjoy my videos, specifically these ones, the disfigurement videos, and my podcasts, which are the ones that take the most time to make, it would mean so much if you could consider supporting me on Patreon. I want to keep all of this content free, but I massively appreciate any support from Patreon, which allows me to be able to make this content freely available for everybody. So, as I said, today we're going to be talking about Rapunzel. Before we delve into the history, let's look at the Grimm version of the tale, specifically the 1812 edition, which is available in English in this book here, translated by Jack Zipes, which was published a few years ago. As I mentioned in previous fairy tale videos, the Grimms were great revisionists, and it was the later edition, specifically the one published in 1858, that got translated into English, that was slightly less gruesome than the 1812-1815 versions. So let's look at the original, going to use the air quotes, Grimm tale, and then we'll go back further than that and see where this tale came from. Once upon a time, there was a man and a woman who longed for a child but couldn't have one. They tried for many years until one day, miraculously, the woman fell pregnant. But when she was pregnant, she longed for the Rapunzel flower, which grew in a fairy's garden right behind their house. She began to wither away because she wasn't eating the thing that she most desired, and so her husband, worried for her health, hopped over the fence, went into the fairy's garden and started stealing all of the Rapunzel flowers. He kept on doing this every night until one day the fairy found him, and she said, "Excuse me, what are you doing in my garden, stealing all of my things?" And the man said, "I'm very sorry, but my wife really needs them. She's pregnant, you see, and she's craving them." So the fairy said, "That's all right, you can keep doing that, but I am going to steal your baby." The man wasn't sure that this was actually going to happen, but sure enough, the fairy appeared when the child was born and stole it away. The fairy brought the child up in her own house, but when Rapunzel became 12, she turned into a very beautiful young girl. So the fairy decided to lock her up in a tower, because that's apparently what you do with beautiful girls. This tower had no stairs and only a very small window, and every day the fairy would go there and shout out, "Rapunzel," because she'd named her after that flower, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." So Rapunzel would let down her hair, the fairy would climb to the top, and then one day a prince rode past and saw this happening. So when the fairy went away, the prince came back and repeated the same phrase, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And she did, and the prince climbed up it. The two of them fell in love and started spending a lot of time together, and, shock horror, Rapunzel became pregnant. The fairy was furious. Rapunzel gave birth to twins, and the fairy cut off Rapunzel's hair and banished her to a distant part of the kingdom. Then, when the prince came back and shouted, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," the fairy let down the hair, the prince climbed up it, met the fairy, and the fairy said, "How dare you get my adoptive / kidnapped daughter pregnant? You will never see her again." And upset, the prince threw himself from the tower. He suffered a few broken bones, but was okay apart from the fact that he fell on some thorns. The thorns pricked his eyes and he became blind. So he wandered off in search of the woman that he loved, and eventually he heard her singing. And when she found him, she cried onto his eyes. That healed his eyes. He was able to see, and they lived happily ever after. There are many different motifs tied up in the idea of Rapunzel, the main one being the maiden in the tower, but we have this idea of femininity. I always end up using all of the air quotes when I do these fairy tale videos, but that idea of societal femininity and how that is locked up in the locks of women's hair. I've spoken about this quite a lot because I have alopecia myself, so feel quite a close connection with it, but I also talked about it in my history of the Little Mermaid video, because in that the Little Mermaid sisters give up their hair as the air quotes ultimate sacrifice to try and save their sister. So I'll link my alopecia videos down below, and the Little Mermaid video too. It's often the case with fairy tales that we can trace them back to Greek mythology. We can do that with Beauty and the Beast, with Sleeping Beauty, with Snow White. It's difficult to do that with Rapunzel, though there are many myths where women are locked up in confined spaces, such as Danae, who, if I remember correctly, is locked in an underground copper compartment. But I think the earliest version of Rapunzel with the recognisable letting down of the hair is from a long epic Persian poem in the 900s called Shahnameh, where a woman lets down her tresses so that her lover Zal can climb up to the top. Did you like that motion? After that, we can find lots of different instances of these tales in different cultures. And I've spoken about how this is how fairy tales were transported. We didn't write them down until much later. It's those versions that were written down and collected that we have. But before that, they were told orally. So there are lots of different tales of Rapunzel, and I could go on for days telling you about all of them, but I've chosen some of my favorites to tell you about today. So as I said, there are lots of different versions of Rapunzel in lots of different languages, but there are loads in Italian, and that's probably because Giambattista Basile wrote an Italian version of Rapunzel before it was called Rapunzel in 1634, called Petronella. And in that, the mother didn't crave the Rapunzel flower, she craved parsley, which is somehow less romantic, and it wasn't a fairy's garden either, it was an ogre's. Petronella is then locked up in a tower, and the ogre comes to visit her, and she actually ends up rescuing herself by overhearing about these magical acorns that she then steals and uses as a means of escape. There's another Italian version of the tale called Prunella, in which is the Rapunzel figure who's the one who steals the flowers in the first place. So it feels a little more justified that she's the one that gets punished. And in this, she's locked up in a witch's garden and is forced to do all of these horrible tasks. But then the witch's son falls in love with her and tries to help her out by doing the tasks for her. But she doesn't trust him because he's the son of a witch. And it's only later, when he saves her life, that they end up running away together and living happily ever after. The final Italian version I'm going to mention before moving on to other languages is one called the Fair Angiola, in which 7 women, all neighbours, continually steal fruit from a witch's garden, and they feed her donkey so the donkey won't tell on them. But then the witch notices that all of her fruit is disappearing, so she hides in a hole, and one of the women, thinking that one of her ears is a fruit, tries to pick it, and then the witch jumps up. They all run away apart from one of them, who is captured, and the witch says to her, "You must give me your child when she is 7 years old." As I've mentioned before, the numbers 7 and 3 are really important in fairy tales. So this young girl is called Angiola, and when she is 7, the witch comes back to claim her, and she says to Angiola, "Tell your mum to remember her promise." So Angiola goes to her mum and says, "There is a lady outside who says that you've made a promise to her." And the mother says no, because she doesn't want her daughter to go. And she says, "Next time you see the woman, just pretend that you haven't passed on that message." And that happens 3 times. Again, the repetition is important because it meant that people could remember things more clearly if they were repeated. So the witch approaches the young girl 3 times. 3 times the young girl says, "I didn't pass on that message, I'm terribly sorry." So the witch gets pretty pissed off, so she eats one of her fingers, just to, well, for reasons. And then the young girl Angiola runs back to her mother and she says, "The witch cut off my finger." And she says, "Okay, well, she might eat the rest of you, so you should probably go to her now." So the witch locks her up in a tower. Angiola is cared for by the witch, though. The witch loves her like her own daughter and climbs up her hair every day in this tower to visit her. One day a prince sees this happening, so copies what the witch is doing, climbs up to the top, they fall in love, they decide they're going to run away together, but to stop the furniture in the room telling the witch where they've gone, because apparently animals and furniture all talk in this story, she decides to feed the furniture in order to stop them telling on her, but she forgets to feed the broom. Never forget to feed the broom. And she steals, sorry, Gina's just over here laughing. So they leave having taken 3 balls of magical yarn. It doesn't say how they escape from the tower that she's been locked in. Maybe they use the yarn to let themselves down. I don't know, but anyway, they take that particular yarn with them, and then when the witch returns to the tower looking for Angiola, the broom, having not been fed and being very hungry and angry, hangry in fact, tells the witch where they've gone. I should also say that Angiola had a lovely little dog who ran away with her. So the witch runs after Angiola and the prince, and Angiola uses these 3 balls of yarn and throws them behind her one by one to try and help them escape. The first ball of yarn turned into a mountain of soap and nearly stopped the witch getting past, but she was still able to get over it. The second ball of yarn turned into a mountain of sharp nails and nearly stopped the witch getting over it, but she was able to get through it in the end. The third ball of yarn turned into a mighty river that just kept on and on expanding, and the witch couldn't get past it. But in a fit of fury, she said, "Angela, I curse you and I turn your face into that of a dog." So Angela's face is turned into that of a dog, and the prince says, "I can't take you home to marry you now because you have the face of a dog. My father would never allow it." So he puts her in a cottage in the woods and goes to visit her. She's very sad about it. And then their pet dog decides to run all the way home to the witch and uses persuasive doggish powers to persuade the witch to turn Angela's face back into her own face. And eventually the witch agrees and she forgives Angela, and the prince and Angela marry and live happily ever after. Let's move on to a French one, which is recorded by Madame de Lannoy, who's one of my favourite folklorists, and a lot of her work hasn't been translated into English, which I find so very frustrating. She was a total badass, possibly a spy. I don't know if that's true, but I'm going to believe it because it sounds great. And this is a version of Rapunzel that just kind of runs away with itself in the same way that Jean-Baptiste Basile version of Hansel and Gretel started out as the Hansel and Gretel we know, and then turned into an epic adventure where Gretel becomes a pirate. And if you want to find out about that, I will link it down below. So this is her version, which is called The White Cat, and begins as a Rapunzel story and then just turns into something else entirely. So a king and a queen ruled over 6 kingdoms, and the queen loved exploring. So she would often go out with her group of women who would assist her, and she would go traveling all around the world. And then one day she found a kingdom that had a castle in it, and that castle glowed red out of the forest, and on the bricks of this castle were illustrated all the fairy tales that she had ever heard in her life. And in the grounds of the castle there was lots of fruit, and she so wanted to eat it, but she couldn't get in. Then a fairy appeared and said, "Would you like to eat some of this fruit?" And she said, "I would really love to, because I feel like I'm going to die if I can't eat some of that fruit." And the fairy said, "Well, that's okay, but you must give me your child if you eat this fruit." And she said, "Yeah, okay, I'm really hungry." So she eats the fruit. Apparently it's delicious. She goes back to her kingdom. She forgets about that happening. She has a baby. The fairy comes to collect the baby, and the king and queen say, "No, you can't have our child." So the queen gets her dragon to kill everyone in their kingdom. Where have I heard that before? Oh yeah. So then when that happens, the king and queen say, "Okay, all right, please." I mean, I don't know why, because at this point I don't feel like they have anything to lose, but they hand over their child and the fairy takes it away. She locks the fairy in the tower, and the fairy grows up, becomes a beautiful maiden, lets down her hair, all of that stuff that we're very familiar with. Then one day a prince comes along and falls in love with this girl at the top of a tower. So he climbs up to the top of the tower, and then the princess says, "I would like to run away with you." So they make a plan to run away together, but then the fairy hears about it, and when they try to run away together, the dragon eats the prince, which is not, you know, I mean, it's just a bit extreme. The woman is very upset, the princess is very upset, and the fairy says, "As punishment, I'm turning you into a cat." I was going to say, did you know where that is going? But actually the fairy tale is called The White Cat, so maybe you did. So this is kind of a mix-up between, or should I say a mash-up between Rapunzel and Beauty and the Beast. So the fairy turns this Rapunzel type character into a cat, and she says, "You will be the most beautiful white cat, but the only way that you can turn back into being a princess is if a prince who looks exactly like the one I just had my dragon murder falls in love with you." So, meanwhile, in a distant kingdom, a king is confused because he's trying to work out which of his 3 sons he should leave his kingdom to, which is quite biblical and all that. And he says, "I can't decide who I should leave my kingdom to, so I'm going to set the 3 of you a task. You must go away and bring me back the cutest, smallest dog that I can live in retirement with," which seems just a really very strange request. But, you know, fine. So the 3 sons, they go off looking for the teeny tiniest, cutest dog in all of the land. The youngest son comes across this castle which glows red in the middle of the forest, and on every brick is the image of every fairy tale he's ever read. He knocks on the door, it opens, and there are lots of torches held by disembodied hands. And he walks through this castle, which is full of cats that are playing music and singing and dancing. And then he goes into a banquet hall where there's a beautiful white cat. And she says, "Why don't you sit down and have some food with me?" So he does, and she notices that he looks quite like the prince that she used to love. She drugs him, makes him forget that he's supposed to be on this epic quest. And they have a great year together. They hang out, they go hunting, he rides a horse, she rides on a monkey, as you do. And then when it gets to near the end of the year of his quest, she makes him remember and says, isn't there something that you were supposed to be getting? And he says, oh my goodness, yes, I'm supposed to be finding the teeny tiniest, cutest dog in all the land to take back to my father. And she says, don't worry, here's an acorn, take this back to your father. So he does. The other two sons have brought back, I imagine, lovely chihuahuas, and he has this acorn which he presents to his dad. When his dad opens it, inside is the tiniest dog you've ever seen in your life. And the father says, well, this is very nice, but I've thought of another task that you could do. I need some beautiful silk in my retirement. Go away and find the thinnest, loveliest thread that you possibly can. So the three of them go away. The youngest goes back to the castle, to the cat, spends another year with her. She presents him with a walnut, which he takes back to the king. When he opens it, it is the thinnest thread you could possibly imagine that he's able to thread through a needle, the eye of a needle, 6 times. He says, okay, well, that's great. I have my dog and I have my silk, but I'm going to set a third task. I say that whoever gets the most beautiful bride in the next year will inherit my kingdom. So off they go. He goes back to the cat and he says, I don't know what to do. And she says, trust me, cut off my head. So he does, and he cuts off her head and she turns into a beautiful maiden, and he takes her back to her father and he says, wow, she's really quite something. And she says, actually, that's fine. I'm not here to take your kingdom. I already have 6 kingdoms of my own that I've inherited from my parents. So actually, I'm going to gift you a kingdom. I'm going to gift each of your 2 sons a kingdom, and then we're going to rule over the other 3 kingdoms. I don't want to, come over and steal all of your stuff. And the father says, well, that's really great. And they live happily ever after, though forgetting that the father has not actually solved the problem that he was trying to solve in the first place. But, she's no longer a cat, and the end. There's also an Egyptian version of the tale called Luya, Daughter of Morgan, in which the idea of the maiden in the tower is a curse which is bestowed on people. So there are parents who really want a child and can't have one, and they make a promise to the local community saying, if they have a son, they'll call him Yosef, and they will build 3 wells, one filled with honey, one with butter, and one with rose water. But then they forget, and their communities start to starve. So they quickly build these wells. Everyone comes and takes what they need. And then an old woman comes when the wells are empty, and she manages to scrape just enough off the sides. But as she turns to go, Yosef, the young boy, gets in her way accidentally and makes her drop everything and lose all the things she's worked hard to get out of the well. So she says, I curse you with Luya, daughter of Morgan. Now Yosef doesn't know what this means. He asks everyone, his parents cry, they don't want to tell him, but it turns out it means he's been cursed with going on this quest to find this beautiful woman locked in a tower, and no one has ever returned successfully from this quest. However, he decides to accept the quest and go on it. And on his way, he meets 4 ogres. And because he's polite to the ogres, which no one has ever been before, they help him, and he manages to get to the tower and marry the woman locked up in it, which I think is quite cool. Kindness, always be kind. Along with the white cat, which I think is one of my favorite versions of Rapunzel because it's so endless and ridiculous. Another favorite of mine is a Russian fairy tale called Golden Hair, which is about a woman with golden hair. But not only is her hair golden like the sun, it is actually made of gold. And I kind of love how literal that is. A hunter called Alip goes to a lake where he sees a beautiful woman sitting, and this woman proposes to him. She proposes to him, and he says, I would love to marry you, let's go. And she says, I can't move because my hair weighs so much. Like, she literally cannot move. The reason that her hair is made of gold is because she is the daughter of Polos, the great snake, who's in the Siberian folklore, and he rules over and controls all of the gold in the land. So Alip goes to help her. He picks up her hair, which is obviously really heavy, so she can stand up, and the two try and make their escape. But then suddenly her father appears and in a rage cuts off Golden Hair's hair, which is very difficult to say, and drags her underground, which I think makes this tale a little bit like Persephone. Golden Hair's nanny then tells Aelip that he should come back in 3 years' time. Again, we have the number 3. He says that if he comes back and she remembers him and still wants to leave with her, maybe that will mean that their love will be so powerful that they'll be able to escape. So this happens several times, but each time the father appears and each time Aelip keeps on coming back. Meanwhile, on his travels, Aelip discovers this great lake and he hears tell that Polyph the snake cannot go underneath it. He has no control under this lake. I like to think because this is a lake that's made of silver and that clashes with his gold. I don't know, that's just something I've created in my head. It's not in the story, but let's go with it. So then the final time he goes to rescue her, manages to get her away, and then the two of them live under this, let's say, silver lake very happily for the rest of their lives. Before we go, let's quickly look at the real history of Rapunzel. There was Saint Barbara who existed in the 3rd century. So Saint Barbara, it's questionable whether or not the things that happened to her did happen, which is why she's been removed from the Roman calendar, but she's still classed as a saint. And as with anything, I'm sure that a woman called Barbara did exist and that some of these things happened to her. They've just become embellished over time, turned into legend, and then became fairy tale. Barbara was locked up in a tower by her father, who was trying to protect her because she was a very beautiful woman, and apparently that meant that you had to be locked up. He was a pagan. She secretly converted to Christianity, which was not okay in his books. He didn't know about this, went off on business, and when he was away, she saw that he had requested that a personal bathhouse be built with 2 windows, but she secretly requested that they actually add a 3rd window and turn it into a private bathhouse with 3 windows to represent the Holy Trinity. And when her father saw this, he said, "Girl, you must have converted to Christianity, that's not okay." And she said yes, and she ran away. He chased her, she prayed very hard, and a opening on a hill appeared and she was able to dart inside it and hide. But a shepherd betrayed her, told her father where she was, and then he was turned to stone and his flock of sheep was turned into locusts. This is the bit that I'm not sure actually happened. Then her father found his daughter, dragged her home, tortured her and beheaded her. But in the meantime, miracles were occurring in this bathhouse that she had created because she'd created this magical Christian space. So that is why she was made a saint. So there we go. That's a bit of real life history with regard to Rapunzel, alongside some of the tales, versions of Rapunzel that I really, really love that led up to the Grimm's version and then the versions that we happen to know today. So if you enjoyed this video, please do consider supporting me on Patreon. Patrons supporting me mean that I am able to create these history of fairy tale videos along with all of the other videos and podcasts on my channel. I want to make sure that all of the content I create on here is free, but as you can imagine, it takes a lot of time to research and make these, so any support that you can offer is very much appreciated. And there are other things over on Patreon, such as behind the scenes writing stuff, writing prompts, a book club, text analysis, postcards, so go and have a look. I am going to leave you and I will be back very soon with another video. Lots of books love. Bye.